I'm so happy to be hosting this talk. As you see, the title of the talk is Registered Reports as an Open Research Practice by Professor Kara Morgan Short from the University of Illinois, Chicago. And over to you, Professor Morgan Short. I'm going to stop sharing screen. Yeah, you can go ahead, share your screen, and I'm sure it's going to be very informative.
Hopefully so.
Definitely.
Okay, I think I am good. Okay. Should I go ahead and get started now? You can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. And I think,
okay.
Yeah, it's good.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much for to the organizers for having me talk today about registered reports as an open research practice. I'm particularly glad that this talk is coming on the heel of Kevin McManus's great talk about replication. I think you're going to find connections and synergy between the two talks. Yeah, so I'm excited to share with you more about registered reports today. Okay, as we know, the validity, reliability, and replicability in research has been a concern across multiple fields of inquiry. For example, in psychology, when a team of researchers set out to replicate 100 previously published studies with statistically significant results, and you can see those p-values here in this figure, only 36% of the replications, which you see here, also had statistically significant results. So the p-values were much more broadly distributed. Also, only 47% of the original effect sizes, which you can see here, fell within the 95% confidence intervals of the lower replication effect sizes, which you see here. As of yet, we don't really have a systematic measure. We haven't carried out a systematic measure of the replication rate in applied linguistics, but we know that the rate of replication is low. For example, we've estimated that the rate of replication is only 0.26% for second language research and 2.4% in experimental linguistics in general. Concerns about validity and reliability have also been raised in our field. But why have these issues emerged? Well, when we inspect the typical hypothetical deductive research cycle from hypothesizing to publishing, we can identify several questionable research practices that threaten validity, reliability, and replicability of research at different points, including p-hacking, where analysis decisions might be made during analyses that bias results to be statistically significant, or harking, where hypotheses are specified after the results are already known, making results look as if they are confirmatory when they're really exploratory results. And publication bias is another questionable research practice that comes into play, where decisions about manuscript publication may be based on whether the results are statistically significant or not. Now, in most cases, these questionable research practices are most likely unintentional, but they exist in our field, with 97% of surveyed applied linguists self-reporting having engaged in one or more questionable research practices. And I will admit that I myself am one of those people within the 94%. Various solutions have been proposed to improve validity, reliability, and replicability in our research. And several of these solutions involve open science practices, which we're talking about today and tomorrow. And these include registered reports, the focus of my talk. So what are registered reports, and why do we think of them as an open science solution to the questionable research practices that I just discussed. Registered reports is an article type that is offered by journals. For a registered report article, authors motivate and design their study and submit it to peer review before data collection occurs. If the editor and reviewers agree that the study is motivated and has a valid design protocol, a manuscript can receive in-principle acceptance, which means that the journal is agreeing to publish the study after data collection, regardless of the outcome of the results, whether the results are statistically significant or not, as long as the authors adhere to the planned protocol that received the in-principle acceptance and that was registered. So once authors receive in-principle acceptance, researchers then pre-register their protocol, and next they collect and analyze their data. Now, the registered reports article type helps attenuate questionable research practices here, such as harking and p-hacking, because the procedures, materials, and the planned analysis are all registered. Authors should not deviate from this planned protocol, and thus the degrees of freedom that a researcher has in decision-making at this point that could lead to biased practices, even unintentionally, are greatly reduced at the time of data collection and analysis. Next, after collecting data, researchers write their full report, which is reviewed for adherence to the pre-registered protocol that received in-principle acceptance and the reasonableness of the conclusions. Now, final acceptance cannot be decided based on the outcomes because the manuscript already has in-principle acceptance. Thus, publication bias is reduced, if not eliminated, at this stage. So in all, the registered reports article type has the potential to attenuate several of the questionable research practices that come into our research cycle, even unintentionally. And I'd like to take a minute here to talk about the difference between registered reports and pre-registration, which can sometimes be confused. So pre-registration simply, it's not simple to do necessarily, but pre-registration simply is a means of specifying a study's research plan, including methods and analysis, before research outcomes are known. Now, registered reports always include pre-registration. After an author or after a researcher receives in-principle acceptance, they need to pre-register their study before collecting data. So registered reports always include pre-registration, but pre-registration extends much beyond registered reports. I would bet money that the great majority of pre-registrations are independent of registered reports. They're not tied to specific journals. Any researcher can pre-register their methods and their analyses before collecting data and deposit the pre-registration on public repositories. It does not have to be tied to journals at all. Pre-registrations also do not necessarily, unless they're tied with registered reports, do not receive peer review. So again, registered reports always include pre-registration, but pre-registration extends much beyond registered reports. Now, I'm not going to talk more about pre-registration today, but for more information and templates that you can use to pre-register your work, you can see information at the Center for Open Science at this web address. Okay, what I would like to go a bit more into depth into is to talk about the publication and review process for registered reports, which you'll find similarities in this review process to a standard article, but there's also differences. So each registered reports have specific guidelines at each journal, and authors should carefully consult these guidelines. But all registered reports follow a general process. And again, I'd like to talk about the somewhat unique review process involved in registered reports. So let's start with the stage 1 review process, in which the introduction method, and proposed analyses of a study, also potentially pilot data, are submitted in the form of a manuscript to a journal that publishes registered reports. So again, data has not been collected. There's no results, no discussion yet in this manuscript. It's just the introduction, method, and the proposed analyses. Well, you'll see here what looks like a very typical process of review, including editorial triage, the potential with the manuscript, the potential for the manuscript to be rejected at that stage, reviewers being invited, reviewers being able to ask for revisions, and then we can follow that process along until in principle acceptance. Now, what are the editors and reviewers looking for in this stage 1 review? Again, we don't have any results to look at. We don't have any discussion of the results. So what is really being examined here is, 1, is there a motivation to conduct the study? Is the study going to tell us something, whether that's novel information or whether that's replicating a previous study that merits replication? Is there a purpose for this study? Is that motivated? The second thing that editors and reviewers will be looking for here is the quality, their estimates, their evaluation of the validity, reliability, and the overall quality of the methods and the proposed analyses. And they can ask for revisions. So if you have designed a study in a certain way and a reviewer happens to see a confound that maybe you didn't see when you designed the study, they can bring that up and that can be addressed before data is collected. So that's one of the advantages of registered reports, is some of these potential methodological issues can be ironed out before data is collected, so you don't end up with a study that you submit and then a reviewer says, oh, but this is a problem in the method, so it can't be published. Okay, so at stage 1, again, editors and reviewers are looking for whether the study is motivated and the quality of the proposed study, the methods, and the analysis. If the manuscript is judged favorably for those 2 criteria, then the manuscript is given in principle acceptance, again, meaning the journal is promising to publish the study regardless of how the results come out, as long as the authors follow the planned protocol that is being approved and make reasonable conclusions based on their results. So then the authors go and collect their data. And then after they've collected the data, they write up the second stage manuscript that now also includes the results and the discussions and the discussion. Here, reviewers are again invited to review the manuscript, but now they're not paying attention to what do they think of the quality of the methods. Is the study motivated? That's already been pre-approved. Here, what they're going to be looking for are 2 things. 1, did the authors follow the pre-registered, in principle accepted protocol that was registered? And 2, do they make reasonable conclusions about the results that they found? So this stage of review can go quite quickly because it's partly a kind of a checklist. Did you do what you said you were going to do? And then are your conclusions reasonable? Now, manuscripts still could be rejected at this stage in theory if you're making some, really wild conclusion based on results that don't merit that conclusion, and you're not willing to, revise that based on editor and reviewer feedback. But as we'll see later, for the most part, stage 2 reviews go pretty quickly and are quite successful. Okay, so if you're interested in submitting a registered report, how widely available are they? They are increasingly available. They were first introduced in Cortex in 2013 and in our field in language learning in 2018, and they're now available at over 300 journals, including several journals focusing on language and linguistics, for example, in second language research, in bilingualism, language and cognition, and other related journals. But before we embrace registered reports more broadly, before everybody here goes out and does a registered report, you might want to know, well, do they really address those questionable research practices that, that we talked about earlier? So we might want to consider evidence. Is there evidence that registered reports do indeed reduce questionable research practices and improve validity, reliability, and replicability in our field? Are they really useful as we say they should be? So first, let's consider the meta-science evidence suggesting reduced publication bias for registered reports. So registered reports have been shown to have lower percentages of positive or statistically significant results. 2 studies have found that registered reports have such less results that are statistically significant. So for Allen and Miller, they looked at registered reports that were both replications and novel research, and overall found that about 60% of findings published in registered reports were null results. And that was compared to the low reported percentages from traditional literature. Similarly, Shield et al. Found that more hypotheses were not supported. Here, this light purple are the hypotheses that are not supported in registered report. So these were null findings here as compared to standard reports. Now, since low rates of null results are suggestive of publication bias, the fact that significantly more null results here and here are getting published through registered reports suggests that publication bias is indeed attenuated in registered reports. Meta-science evidence also suggests that results reported in registered reports are more reliable than in the standard literature. Specifically, Opels et al. Calculated the computational reproducibility of results reported in registered reports, basically looking at whether reported results are reliable if another researcher conducts the same analysis on the same data. Opels et al. Found that for the 36 studies that were registered reports and that had data and code available, they were able to reproduce the results without consulting the authors of the initial studies for 21 articles, which is 58% of the articles were computationally reproducible. Now, this may not seem entirely impressive. We would like to think that all of our results are reliable. If we have something published in an article, we can go and do the analysis and get that same result. But a previous study in the traditional literature showed that only 31% of results could actually be reproduced. So here, Opels is showing a double the percentage of computationally reproducible results in registered reports. Okay, what about the validity of registered reports? A recent study asked researchers to rate registered reports and standard articles on several qualities. Now, these raters were blind to whether they were rating a registered report or a standard article. And here we can see the results for several of the qualities they were asked about. Now, this 0 line here represents no difference between ratings for registered reports and standard articles, and more positive values represent higher ratings for registered reports. Now, if we take ratings about quality and rigor as a proxy for validity, then we see that registered reports have higher ratings than standard articles. And apparently, this does not come at the cost of creativity, which sometimes is a concern that registered reports pre-registering your methods may impede creativity, because here we see that creativity of methods was judged to be at least as good as those of standard articles. Okay, tying into Kevin's talk here about replications, will registered reports help our field have more replications? So indeed, Sheila et al. Found that replications were more common in registered reports than standard articles, with 58% of registered reports being replications versus only 3% of standard articles. Why might this be? Well, if a researcher conducts a replication through a standard publishing route, they might be particularly vulnerable, at least traditionally, they might have been particularly vulnerable if the replication results were no results, because reviewers might point out some inconsistency between the replication and the initial study and attribute the null results to the change in the method. And that could potentially be a very valid concern, but it can be hard to distinguish post hoc. So registered reports guards against this outcome because the replication protocol would be reviewed and approved, and any differences between the two studies would be established, known, and approved before data is collected. And ideally, one of the researchers from the initial study that's being replicated would be one of the reviewers for the replication. Also, usually registered reports require high statistical power, which makes interpretation of null results easier. And finally, registered reports guards against publication bias for null results, which may be especially strong for replication studies, especially traditionally. So registered reports may be a particularly protected way for researchers to conduct replication studies. Okay. So we've talked about the rationale for registered reports. We've described the process and the peer review process for registered reports and some of the benefits that we think may be coming from registered reports, at least as indicated by preliminary meta-science data. But nothing is perfect, and that is true for registered reports. And there's several questions and concerns about registered reports that we need to be open and transparent about. So I would like to talk about some of those concerns. A first question that emerged, or an initial question that emerged with registered reports, particularly when they were first introduced, is would they prevent exploratory research? If everything had to be specified, all the methods, all the analysis had to be specified up front, does that prevent us, does that tie researchers' hands in conducting exploratory research? And the answer is simply no, it doesn't. Exploratory analysis can be reported in registered reports. There's nothing that says you can't report exploratory analyses in a registered report, as long as it is in addition to the planned analysis that received in principle acceptance and were pre-registered. So you go, you do your data collection, you do your analysis as you had registered as in your in principally accepted protocol. And if something comes up, say it didn't go, the results didn't go the way you expected, and you want to look into your data to try and understand, well, why didn't the results work the way I expected it? That can all be reported as exploratory analyses. And then what you have very clearly are the results that are tied to your confirmatory analysis published in one section, and then the exploratory analyses published in a different section in the manuscript. So we really are able to distinguish what was confirmatory and what was exploratory. And I believe that most registered reports do include exploratory analysis sections. So this is not uncommon in registered reports. Another question that people have asked about registered reports is, well, what happens if something goes wrong? What happens if a world experiences a pandemic, for example? What are researchers' hands then tied, and they just have to completely drop the project? They have to withdraw their registered report. This is not the case. There is flexibility with registered reports. So if something happens, whether on a large scale or on a small scale, and some changes are needed, those are possible in consultation with the editor, and possibly for larger issues, the editor would consult also with the reviewers about these changes. So there is flexibility in registered reports because we do all know that, that things come up large and small when we're engaging in research. Okay, another concern that I think we are still really dealing with as a field and across fields is the timing of registered reports. So do registered reports take longer to publish compared to standard articles, or are they going to slow our research down? Now, we might theoretically think that slow research is a good way to approach research, but in our field and in academia, at this point, we're still not really rewarded for slow research. We have pressures on about productivity in terms of quality as well as quantity, quantity as well as quality. So what happens with registered reports in this regard? Well, maybe they do take somewhat longer to publish. So the review process at one journal may take longer because there are 2 stages of peer review for registered reports. So maybe it does take a little longer. Also, I think it's really important to point out that even if we can accept a little bit longer, if a little bit more of a time commitment for registered reports, another challenge with the timing of registered reports is that researchers do not have full control over the timing of data collection, because this is going to depend on that stage 1 research review process, which may involve revisions. So if you submit a registered report in April and you need to start collecting your data in September for a particular reason, you cannot necessarily be guaranteed that your review process, that stage 1 review process, will be completed and you'll be able to start your data collection in September. So this is because you might be asked for revisions, and those revisions might take you a little bit longer than anticipated. So you really can't know exactly when your data collection can begin. Now, this can be particularly challenging, I think, for PhD students and postdocs, especially when they have program requirements that have strict deadlines. So I wouldn't necessarily suggest doing a registered report for a requirement that has a deadline. But I know a lot of PhD students might have a couple of, 1 or 2 or more simultaneous projects going on. So they might have a project going on that has a deadline, and then they could have another project going on that is a registered report that has more flexibility in terms of timing. This timing can also be challenging for grant-funded projects, because grant-funded projects might come with very specific timelines for using the money. But we need to consider that stage 2 review is relatively fast. So even though we have 2 stages of peer review, that stage 2 review is relatively fast. We're just doing a check on, did you do what you're saying? Did you do what you said you were going to do? And are your conclusions reasonable? Also, the overall review time is probably not longer than for regular articles that might end up being resubmitted to multiple journals if they're not accepted at the first journal that they're submitted to. And also consider that the rate of publication in registered reports seems to be high. So even if it does take a little bit longer, you might have more likelihood of being published. So for example, at Cortex, the rate of rejection, once you pass editorial triage, the rate of rejection is 10%, only 10% at stage 1 peer review, and so far is 0% at stage 2 peer review, showing that stamp of in-principle acceptance really is almost a guarantee of your article being published. And that guarantee you get before you start collecting your data. Again, it's not an absolute guarantee. You do have to do what you said you would do, and you have to make reasonable conclusions from your data. But effectively, in principle acceptance, at least at Cortex, is acceptance. But meta science data is really needed to better understand the efficiency and the timing. A lot of the points that I'm making here do not have meta science behind them yet in regard to the pointing. So we really don't know if it takes longer or not. Okay. Another concern that's been expressed in terms of registered reports is if registered reports lead to a greater number of null results, is that going to result in lower impact for registered reports research? And that might be a concern for individual researchers as well as for journals that might be concerned about impact. But preliminary evidence suggests that maybe no. That registered reports are cited as much as standard articles. And in this, the authors of this article even say they are cited as much or potentially a little bit more than standard articles. So you don't seem to take a hit in terms of impact if we're measuring impact by citations. And that's a whole discussion in and of itself. Okay, so what are ways forward with registered reports? I have really, I think, 2 or 3 more slides left, and then there'll be time for questions. So ways forward and resources for registered reports. Registered reports would be good that there's increased focus on replications. Again, registered reports can be a particularly good avenue for publishing replications because of the protection of publication bias, because any differences that might have to emerge between the initial study and the replication, that would all be clear, transparent, and approved before data is collected. So here's an example of increasing focus on registered report replications. The SLA for All initiative that Aline Godfroyd and Sibla Andrinja are conducting at Language Learning. Now this is already in process, but other initiatives could follow this lead. There's also registered replication reports as a very specific article type where the registered report has to be a replication. This is available at some journals in psychology, but also might be one way of increasing replications in our field. We need to consider changing the incentive structure. I'm sure there's lots of discussion about that for all of the talks that across the symposium these 2 days, and particularly in regard to funding. A significant, not field-wide initiative, but I think a significant initiative in and of itself is through Language Learning's Registered Report Early Career Researchers Grant, that every year 2 grants of $10,000 are earmarked specifically for registered reports being conducted, registered report proposals being conducted by early career researchers. So there's support for engaging in this type of article. And finally, there are other initiatives that, sorry, I have to adjust my screen here. Journal independent registered reports. For example, the peer community and registered reports is a very interesting initiative where you can get reviews for registered reports and in principle acceptance independent of particular journals, but there's journals aligned with this community that if you get the in principle acceptance from this peer community, then a journal will agree to take on that registered report and publish it. So lots of different initiatives being developed for registered reports and different versions of registered reports. And there's many, many more initiatives described in Chambers and Sitvela 2022. Okay, so maybe I've piqued your interest a little bit in registered reports, and you want to take at least a deeper look into what they are. What are some resources? Where can you turn? How can you start engaging in registered reports? I would first recommend reading Chambers and Sitvela 2022, The Past, Present, and Future of Registered Reports. This is really an excellent article. It's so well written. It's so concise, but packed with information. And it has pull-out boxes that talk about information for editors, information for reviewers, information for researchers. It's just a really great article. At this point, I would suggest starting here to read more about registered reports. Also, the Center for Open Science, they have a registered report webpage, and there's many registered report webinars. For example, here's one that's specifically for early career researchers. There's webinars that are just kind of open question and answer webinars. And there's webinars for example, for being a reviewer or an editor for being registered reports. So there's really a ton of information on this page. There's also a checklist that you can use for ensuring that your registered report submission is a quality one. And you should also carefully check the journal guidelines, because every journal can tweak their version of registered reports to work for their journal and for their specific field of inquiry. So you would always want to check the journal guidelines. And that's all I have for you for now. I'm really happy to engage in question and answers about registered reports. I've had experience with registered reports, both as part of the team of language learning that introduced registered reports. And also I have my own stage 1 in principle acceptance for a registered report. So I'm going through the process myself as a researcher. So hopefully that experience can help me answer your questions. I'd like to acknowledge that this presentation was informed greatly by Chambers and Sitvala, which I've noticed that I've misspelled twice now in my presentation, and current work with Emma Marsden on an in-progress manuscript that we're working on, Why Are Open Research Practices the Future for the Study of Language Learning. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very informative talk. I really enjoyed listening to your talk, like going over the questionable research practices, which are not necessarily intentional, the benefits of registered reports, some concerns, and also charting our way forward. We have some questions here. So the first one, which is composed of 2 parts, I'm going to read the question for you. So is reviewing a registered report more time consuming for reviewers? This is the first part. And then the second part, is there any attrition of reviewers based on your experience? If yes, how does this affect the review process? On the one hand, the reviews may be less onerous because the reviewer can intervene earlier on, but the diagram indicated a lot of potential for reviewing or re-reviewing. I would be interested to hear the feedback from the editors or reviewers' perspective.
Yes, this is a great question. And there really are a lot of questions, as this is a relatively new practice in our field. You know, registered reports have been around for less than 10 years in general, and less than 5 years in our field, that for each single one of those arrows, there's questions about, okay, well, what about this? And what about that? So this is a really good question. I would like to see meta-science data about whether reviewing a registered report is more time consuming for reviewers. There's 2 stages. Ideally, we'll have a reviewer both involved at stage 1 and stage 2. So there are 2 stages. So because of that, there might be some more time involved in the review. But remember that stage 1 review, you don't have the results or the discussion yet. You're really just reviewing the motivation for the study, the literature review, and the motivation for the research questions and the methods. So there's not as much material there to review. You probably will review it more in depth because you'll be able to take a look further into the methods. The stimuli would be available, the planned analyses, and ideally the contingencies. So, say you're going to do a certain statistical analyses, but then your data don't meet those the assumptions of that statistical analysis. So what are your contingency plans if your data, say, are not normally distributed? What do you do then? That should be specified in the registered report. So you might be digging in a little bit more in detail into some of these aspects of the studies, and they can be changed. So I'm hesitant to say that being a reviewer it's more time consuming for a reviewer, but I also want to be open and transparent that maybe it is. And I really would like to see data looking at the timing, both from the author's perspectives and from the reviewer's perspectives of registered reports. Now, in my experience, I believe there's only one time from the registered reports manuscripts that I handled as associate editor of language learning, and I think I worked for about 2 years with registered reports. There's only, I believe, one instance when we had a reviewer who was not able to engage in the second stage review. Now I might be misremembering, but it doesn't seem any different than with regular reviews, where if there's revisions, we would hope, at least my approach as an associate editor is to bring back the, so it's, well, I'm no longer associate editor, I'm moving on to new things now, but is to bring back the same reviewers so that you don't have like a whole nother set of issues that get brought up. So that hasn't seemed to be an issue any more than it is for standard articles. But I think it would be really great for the language learning and other journals that are now doing registered reports to look at that. So we really have a sense both from the perspective of the reviewers and of the authors in regard to timing of the review process.
Thank you very much for your thorough answer. We have another question. Do you have any suggestions of how one can persuade local journal boards to adopt registered reports? Local country journals serve a useful purpose of hosting contextualized research that international journals would not necessarily be interested in. It would be great to have such an option, to have rigorous review process in my country. That's to say, South Africa.
Sure, I know that there have been efforts in linguistics in general where there was a petition that was being signed and going around. I can look that up and send it to you, to ask journals to introduce registered reports, to adopt registered reports into their journals. But one thing there, the Center for Open Science, the webpage that they have a whole section that is for editors. So there's no reason that you could not reach out to these particular journals and ask them if they would consider registered reports and direct them to those resources. So there's a lot of resources that that Emma Marsden and I used when we were really working to implement registered reports in language learning, where they have the whole like description of what a reviewer should be looking for a registered report. What's the process for editors? There's just so much helpful information there that can really be adopted and adapted to particular journals and fields of inquiry. So, you know, there's no reason you can't reach out individually and ask the journal, would they consider adopting this article type, and here's resources for it. But again, that could also be done through some petitioning efforts.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Emma says, based on her experience at Language Learning Journal, she says, we have not experienced more attrition, back to the previous question, and we have not experienced any comments that the review process is more onerous, back to the previous question. We have one more question here, and I think we have time for this one as well. So the question is, on one hand, I find the findings that registered reports have lower percentages of positive results very exciting. But on the other hand, I also wonder whether there is some selection bias in this? That's to say, authors choose registered reports mainly for studies that they worry or anticipate to be less likely to produce positive results.
Yeah, that's a really interesting comment. And I think that potentially that's fine if that's the case, as long as the study is motivated, as long as there's a reason to do the study, and you have, hypotheses, even if they're not very strong hypotheses, it still might be a safer way to go to publish a registered report. So I don't think that's necessarily problematic in terms of the null results. Now, that would be interesting for the meta science data that is looking at whether registered reports attenuate publication bias, because that point exactly would need to be considered. Is there some self-selection in at the initial point of submission for registered reports that leads to that higher rate of null results? So yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, especially for meta science to address when they're looking at publication bias and registered reports. But I don't think it's necessarily problematic in terms of the research process itself.
Thank you very much. We have no more questions, I guess. But I have two quick questions,
Sure.
very quick. I wonder if the title of the articles mentions that this has been a pre-registered report. And also, on the other hand, do we have a number about the statistics of pre-registered reports published in, for example, language learning journal? Like how many papers or a percentage maybe?
Yes. Wait, can you repeat your first question?
The first one is like, do the title of the articles show something that this article has been pre-registered after they are being accepted to be published?
Okay. Good question, right? And in line with what we're talking about for replications. So to my knowledge, the journals that have registered reports can be noted in the title itself. And I believe that sometimes it is. That would be something interesting to go in and look at. I haven't thought about that before, but usually what would happen is the journal would indicate, they have different article types, such as, registered reports or a research article or a commentary, or they have labels for the particular journal types or article types, and registered reports, and a registered report article would be labeled as a registered report article, even if it weren't in the title. But that's really interesting to think about, is how much are people putting that it is a registered report in their own title. And then in terms of the numbers of registered reports, I should have pulled that up. I even asked Emma for that data the other day, and now I'm hesitant to give exact numbers. But I believe that we've processed that language learning, I think in the last year, the last report had processed 110 non-unique submissions. So now that includes revisions. So quite a few registered reports. And I believe that we have about 7 now that have been all the way through the process and have been published. So given that registered reports were introduced just 3 years ago, we're getting quite a bit of interest, both in submissions and now the publications coming out. So I think people are interested in doing this, and hopefully we'll see more.
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you very much for this very nice and informative talk. I do appreciate that. And now we have like 11 minutes to have a break, and I will see you in 11 minutes for the roundtable talk.
Great. Thank you all.